Tina koto katoa. So I got through that, so I feel pretty good now. I didn't say I want to go to the bathroom or something embarrassing, so thank you for that. I first want to acknowledge the people, the original people whose land we stand on. I have to tell you that me and my wife are just thrilled to be here. New Zealanders are warm people. You have welcomed us. You have made us feel at home, and I got to tell you, we just want to thank you for the welcome that you've given us so far. I have learned a lot in the past 48 hours, and I'm very appreciative of that. Hopefully I get a chance to give something back to you this evening and this afternoon. And I want to just thank you for the welcome. And I also want to point out something that was really striking for me and has been striking for me for the last couple of days. And it's been the way this conference has really embraced the Maori culture. I live in a country where, we're very diverse, and you don't always see that kind of respect. And I think that says a lot about the conference planners and those of you who are here. And I just want to acknowledge how awesome I think it is that that's done. Now, what I want to do today, yesterday I ended with my grandma. Today I'm going to start with my grandma. And the reason I'm going to start with my grandma, now you can tell from this picture that I was my grandmother's favorite grandchild. Look at how she's looking at me. Now, yes, oh, thank you. Now, the reason she's looking at me like that is because I was actually the first. She used to call me the first rat in the barn. So I know in this picture I really am her favorite grandchild because I'm the only one at this point. But I think it was still that later on. But one of the things my grandmother said, who grew up in the South, and I told you yesterday that she had a life that was pretty challenging growing up in the South as an African American. But she had this way and these values of saying, you know what, if you don't have anything, if you only have a grain, you always share that with other people. And so my grandmother was very much about sharing. And so it's in her spirit that I want to share some things today. And it's really about transformational change. And as was said, I want this to be more interactive today. So what I want to do is talk for maybe about 30 minutes or so. And yesterday I talked a lot about what we have done in Philadelphia, what we did. I'm no longer there. Today I want to talk a little bit about things we've learned along the way. And I want to put it in this context. Yesterday I told you all the great stuff, right? But I could tell you, and I could spend way more time telling you about all of the challenges that we have in that system, had in that system, will continue to have. And so I really want to share with you today some of the lessons learned, some of the things that maybe I would have done differently, some of the things that we sort of stumbled into and they kind of worked. And hopefully they will be things that will be useful to you in your work. Is everybody with me? Remember what I told you yesterday? Is everybody with me? Okay, thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk about transformational change, and transformational change, in my mind, means something very different than incremental change. Incremental change is tweaking around the edges. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, do we and can we have a vision of a very different world that we work in that addresses many of the challenges that we talked about yesterday when we dissected the black box paradigm that we use, right? And so transformational change is not tinkering around the edges. It's fundamentally changing how we think about and approach the work. And based on the conversation that we had yesterday, I think most people in this room are in agreement that there's some things that we can do to fundamentally, and that we need to do to fundamentally change how we approach the work. So just to kind of remind you of where we started. When I was hired in Philadelphia in 2004, Just to give you a little bit of context. I had been hired, the people before me had done some pretty incredible work that was very structural. In the US, we have a very complicated financing scheme. We have private dollars and public dollars and multiple streams of public dollars, and they had done some pretty sophisticated work in pulling all of that together and creating a coherent department. But what they acknowledged was that they hadn't done a lot of work thinking about what was the system and how were we going to approach the services. And so at the time I was in Connecticut, I came there, and if you know anything about Philadelphia, how many of you have been to Philadelphia? Okay, a number of you. Philadelphia is a northeastern city, which is very, and can be very parochial, can be a tough place, doesn't really take too kind to people from the outside coming and telling folks what to do. Can't do that. And when I went there, I knew absolutely no one. Literally no one, had no connections. And I was hired to help transform the system in Philadelphia. And so we began this process of talking about what that would look like and how we wanted to change. And over a period of time, we were able to develop a consensus around a direction that we wanted to go, some values that we wanted to undergird the work that we were doing, some goals that we wanted to have for people. But it was this very consensus-building process. I give you that context just to sort of remind you that at the very beginning of this process, we were all starting together. Now, I was a political appointee. And for those of you who've been, in government, there's a term, at least in the US, and it's called the WeeBees and the UBees. How many of you heard that term before? Okay, well, let me tell you what the WeeBees and the UBees are. The WeeBees are the folks who say, "We be here when you be gone." In other words, we know you're going to go out with the mayor, and so we're going to outweight you on this recovery stuff that you're coming in here talking about. And so when we first started talking about changing the system, there were a lot of people that literally and figuratively did this: "We'll outweight you." Now, fortunately, I stayed there long enough through 3 mayors, and I outweighted many of them to my delight, seeing some of them actually retire and move on. But that was sort of the context. Let me tell you a couple, and I sort of yesterday sort of juxtaposed where we started, where we ended. But let me give you a couple of other things that we were able to accomplish in terms of moving the system. One of them was having many more people who were engaged in the community around behavioral health issues, which is very important to us because, as we've talked about, these issues are impacting many people's lives, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the people in the field who were talking about them, but it was the whole community, and we think we accomplished that. We were able to create more cross-sector capacity, meaning people in the fire department or the police department or in schools and so forth were much more cognizant and had much better capacity to deal with addiction and mental health issues. Greater stakeholder competency, spending a lot of resources and energy on things like mental health first aid and other kinds of training. I'll talk a little bit about some of those strategies. And improve recovery rates for certain groups that, again, I talked about yesterday, people who were homeless, experiencing homelessness, people who had very serious mental illness who were literally stuck in inpatient units and so forth. And then we were also able, because we were able to get those efficiencies, save a lot of money, like millions of dollars. In the course that I was commissioner, we saved about $150 million over about 10 years, which we were then able to reinvest back into the system. And so when we talk about the importance of creating optimal and effective treatment, that's one of the ways that we get the resources to help make some of the changes that we think are important. Everybody still with me? Okay, so let me just give you one quote, and I won't read the whole thing, but one of the things that we try to do throughout our work is keep our ears to the voice of people with lived experience, people who are going through the system. And I like this particular quote because this person talks about, I felt like they understood where I was coming from, and they showed me respect. I feel blessed to have had time at this program, blah, blah, blah. I shouldn't say blah, 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 but et cetera, et cetera. And they start by saying this wasn't like any other program. So the person experienced the treatment process differently because the providers were willing to make changes in how they approach people. And that notion of feeling more respected, it was really central to that. So this, again, just one example of the kind of changes that we were trying to get. So let me start with the way I'm going to do this, because I want to get to, and you can start thinking about what kinds of questions or comments you might want to make. But what I want to do is just give you some ideas and principles and concepts, give you a couple of examples for some of them, and then we're going to open it up and we can have a dialogue and conversation. So let me start with some general ideas. So the first thing is that when we take on systems are like ocean liners. It takes a lot of energy to turn them and to get them to do things differently. And so the first thing is that to think about the work as a marathon and not a sprint. And that means then that there has to be a willingness to have sustained effort over time, because if you're talking about big changes, they don't happen overnight. And if there's not a willingness to stay in the fight to change the system, it's very difficult to change systems. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be urgency. I assume that if you're in this room, you're like me in the sense that we understand the urgency of what we do. We understand the urgency of being there when people need us. We understand the urgency of getting to the people that need our help. And so even though we know this is a long process, we still know that we have to be intense about how we approach it. That it's nonlinear, which means that I would love if, and many of you know this because we work with people, that progress isn't linear for us as we go through recovery or through any kind of process in our life, and it's not that way with systems. And so there'll be times when systems it looks like we're making a lot of progress, and then it looks like we are staying the same. Now, many of you probably noticed that I'm a bodybuilder. Oh, don't laugh. Now, come on. All right, okay, I'm not a bodybuilder. Okay, I made that up. But if I were a bodybuilder, what they tell me is that sometimes you make lots of progress and then you plateau for a while before you start to make progress again. Some of you are still laughing, and I really feel bad about that. All right, I'm gonna give you a break on that one. All right. But my point is that's the way systems work as well. Another thing that I learned, and these are all things sort of you kind of learn, right? That tolerating ambiguity and contradictions turns out to be a really important skill. The reason is ambiguity, because when you're changing something that's complex, you don't always know the pathway. Now, I'm old enough to remember when we had televisions. You remember the televisions that you would adjust like that to get the picture? I see some head noddings, yeah. Some of you were born with solid state televisions and it just comes on. But back in the day, you actually used to have to adjust to get the picture to come. And you remember how you could kind of see the picture, but you weren't quite sure and you kept dialing it, and finally it would come in, right? And then you would tell your sister to stand there with her foot like that on the antenna, right? You know, don't move until the show goes off, right? So that's sort of what systems change can be like. You're not quite sure, you kind of see it, and you have to tolerate that ambiguity of not knowing exactly where you're going, but you kind of know that you're going there. And the other part of that is tolerating contradictions. Now, let me give you an example of that. as commissioner, I tried to spend a lot of time going around to programs. And there were days when I would go to programs and there would be great progress. And, I'd just be so happy. Man, they're being recovery-oriented and people are happy to be in the program, et cetera. And then you'll go the next day and it was like they heard none of this. Guess what? That's okay. You're still making progress. And so a big part of systems change is being able to tolerate that. And then the last point I want to make is enjoy the journey. If we're not having fun at this, we probably ought to get out of the field. It's hard work, but I think it's very rewarding work. So I'm going to give you 2 other concepts, and then I'm going to give you a series of lessons learned. So this is something that turned out to be very helpful for us in terms of thinking about process. So you have an idea, a vision of where you want to go. How do you get a system to get there? So one of the things we learned and started in our work in Connecticut and then in Philadelphia is that it's really helpful to think about sort of a 3-stage process, and not necessarily sequentially because some of these things overlap, but to be really clear in the very beginning about what the concepts are that you're trying to now embrace. After that, what's the behavior that you want to change? And then how do you sustain it by changing the context? So a simpler way of saying that is, how do we change thinking, behavior, how do we practice, and how do we then change the context? And you really have to do all 3 of those things if you want to make systems change. Let me give you an example. One of the things that we said when we wanted to have more recovery-oriented work was that we wanted psychiatrists to spend more time working with people and talking with people as opposed to simply prescribing medication. So the concept it was, and the thinking that we wanted people to have was that the process of recovery is not just about dispensing medication, but it's also about this building relationships and all the kind of psychotherapeutic work. The behavior was spending more time, but we figured out that the context, the policies didn't allow that to happen. And so what we did was we changed the rates, gave psychiatrists higher rates, and said to the providers that we wanted people to spend more time with people because now there was less pressure. So if we'd have done any 2 of those things and stopped at the process of changing the context, we wouldn't have gotten the behavior that we wanted. Everybody still with me? Okay? So that sort of way of thinking about things from what's the thinking, what's the behavior, what's the context, turns out to be a really useful rubric for thinking about various changes. Another important lesson learned for us is this idea of how people think about change. I started by talking about transformative change. But that's not the only way that people will talk about change, and particularly changing programs and changing systems. So here's when we started the work, both in Connecticut and in Philadelphia, here's one of the first things that people said. When we said we want to be more recovery-oriented, what do you think most of the executive director providers said when we said we want to change the system to be more direct, be more recovery-oriented? What do you think folks said? Agreed? No, they didn't say agreed. I'm sorry? Right, resist. But what's the big barrier? Why can't we do it? We need more? Okay, right. So we need more money. And underlying that thinking was, if you're asking me to do something additional, then it's going to take more money. But we weren't asking them to do something additional. That's additive thinking. I'm doing my work, and you want me to add something. What we were saying is, we want you to do something differently. And so we had to be very explicit with people that we're not just talking about adding to a system that we don't think is the right approach. What we're really trying to get to is more transformational thinking, which is how do we do things differently. Okay, so now I'm going to give you about 10 or 12 lessons learned, and then we're going to jump to hear what your questions are. So here's lesson number 1. Creating a shared vision, co-creating a shared vision is really important. So as a person who's been in government for a very long time, one of the things that we do is we will come up with ideas and then foist them on folks and ask them to follow it. Now, we could have done that, but I don't think we would have been very successful. Rather, what we did was to say, you know what, we have some ideas. We think that we can be more effective, better at what we do. Here's our best thinking. What do you think? And we actually went through a process of literally a year of talking with providers and people in recovery and community people, and over time created a vision that was co-created with various stakeholders in the community. In 2 places that I've worked, we've used that strategy of talking through, building consensus around a shared vision. And in both places, had we not done it, we probably would not have been able to make the kind of big changes that we were attempting to make. If you're interested in a lot of the sort of foundational work that we've done, these are practice guidelines that we developed in Philadelphia. It literally took us 2 years from the time that we started to the time that we finished. And the reason it did is because we did it together, and the whole idea was this. What we wanted to do is to codify and to ensure that we had written down standard guidelines for all of the services in our system. And so we kind of lay out the research, we lay out what people told us, people with lived experience told us, we laid out what we had learned, and then we said, here are the ways that we would like to see services developed and oriented. So if you're interested in that, that's the practice guidelines. You can download them. They're actually for free, so you can get but you can order them through Amazon as well. Secondly, building infrastructure for change. So one of the things that is very clear is that if you're running the trains, it's very hard to build new track. And so if you're in an organization that is trying to shift how it's working, a system that's trying to shift, there has to be some ability to have people who are dedicated to building and doing the new stuff. So I talked yesterday a little bit about the work that we had done with people who are homeless and how we were able to get, by the time I left, we had 1,000 people who had been formerly homeless, most of whom had lived on the streets for over 10 years, into their own home, and I told you the success rate was about 90%. But there was a lot of infrastructure behind that. And as great as our intentions may have been, had we not set up this whole system and infrastructure, it would have been very difficult to get and sustain those kinds of changes. And so thinking about who do we need to have in place, what kinds of systems, what kind of committees, those kinds of things turn out to be really important. Developing conceptual clarity simply means this, that if, especially in the early days when we said, what we want is a recovery-oriented system of care, if you would have asked 10 people, you would have gotten 10 different definitions. And so being really clear about those ideas turned out to be really important. And this was particularly important for people in the addictions world when we started, because the first thing that people in the addictions world told us when we said we wanted to shift to this recovery orientation was, we're already doing that. And so we had to be really clear about, well, what is it that we mean differently? How many of you heard of Bill White? Okay, so some of you heard of Bill White. So Bill White is very influential person in the U.S. in terms of the whole recovery mindset. and the whole recovery approach. And so we used his work a lot to say, here's what we mean. And we talked about things like, if we really believe in recovery, we wouldn't just give people a medallion at the end of their residential program and pat them on the back and say goodbye. Because we would know that in a truly recovery-oriented system, we continue those relationships and continue the support of people beyond the termination of treatment. So we had to be very explicit about saying, here's what we mean when we say and we use this kinds of terms and terminology. Celebrate and promote the work and really celebrate the people and promote the work. When one of the milestones in the work in Philadelphia was a conference that we did probably about second year, third year. At the very beginning of our process, there were very few people in the city who were visibly, were open about their recovery. Because when I came into the field, anonymity was the name of the game. And so people didn't talk about their recovery and being in recovery. And a big part of what we wanted to do is to put a face on recovery. As one of my friends, actually I think it's Bill White, says, people know what addiction looks like in our communities. They know what it looks like when someone is actively addicted. They don't always know and associate what recovery looks like, because when people are in recovery, often they don't talk about it. That's sort of, again, when I came into the field, that's where things were. But as we started to embrace this idea that putting a face on recovery was really important to get the kind of public support that we needed, we were doing a number of intentional things. And so one of the milestones in our process was we had a conference for people in recovery, by people in recovery, to really celebrate recovery, and we were hoping for maybe 100 people to come to the conference. We had to stop the registration at about 600 or 700 people. And what that told us was that people really wanted to be engaged. People wanted to be a part of this movement that was burgeoning. And much of what we were trying to do then was to really create space and opportunity for that to happen. So celebrating the work, creating those kinds of opportunities gives the kind of momentum and excitement that helps to move the work. And that's just talking about peer culture. Big Tent approach. One example of that is we were very intentional about bringing in the faith community, because often when people have addictions, mental health challenges, the first person that they go to is not us. They go to their pastor or their rabbi or their imam, their monk. And so this is just a map of Philadelphia. One of the things we did was we looked at the areas that had some of the highest crime in Philadelphia. And then we were very intentional about going into those communities, identifying the clergy in those areas. We go into a small geographic area, invite the clergy, invite the providers, and then we would do a small mini lecture on mental health and addiction. We would connect the pastors to the providers. And it was a great way of beginning to build relationships and make connections for people. And those people, many of them joined our faith-based initiative. We had a conference that has 500-600 people each year, people, half of whom are people from the faith community, and the other half are people from the treatment world. A lot of overlap in those two groups. And it was a really important group for us to bring into the tent that we were creating. Working at the margins. If a system is really working, it works for everyone. And so we're very intentional about going for groups that were often underrepresented, often didn't have the voice that other groups had. For example, one of the first things we did when we started this work is I created a Asian task force, because we knew that that was a community that was often underrepresented, and we made sure that we had recommendations that got folded into our overall plan to make sure that that community was well represented. So going to the margins, making sure that we get those voices that are not normally highly visible is really important. Create momentum. So here's an S-shaped curve. This is a cumulative curve, and all it means is at the very beginning, there are very few people who are on board, and then over time, that the number of people go up. It's basically a bell-shaped curve. It's flipped. And one of the lessons learned is that if we're trying to create momentum, it's really important to start down here with the early adopters. And for those of us in government, we usually start with the guys and the ladies who are at the other end, the late stage adopters, because we're thinking about the people who are going to be most resistant. We try to create policies to get those people to do what we would like. But the real trick and what we learned is that, man, there are people who are already there. Let's work with those folks and then expand the tent. And then show me the data. And I'm going to show you just one quick example of this. This is penetration data that shows, if you look at the top line, this is the penetration rate for people accessing services in Philadelphia, which is great. But if you break it out by race and ethnicity, you see a very different set of lines, which means that for some people, they're getting access. For other groups, they're not getting access at the rates. When we geo-mapped that, basically looked at utilization rates, what we found was that the best predictor, or what explained that, was that we didn't have programs in the areas that people lived. And so what we did was RFPs in those specific areas. The point is, if we hadn't used the data, we wouldn't have figured that out. And that made a big difference in our ability to reach out to those groups. Base cross-system partnerships on solving others' problems. Just quick example, police encounter people with behavioral health challenges all the time. Started training those folks, made a huge difference in the terms of police interactions with people in the community who had behavioral health challenges. Develop leaders, not managers. Because the whole idea is, can we have distributed power as opposed to highly centralized power? And finally, to innovate, be willing to take risks and to color outside the lines, as I put it, and to push the envelope.